Uh, well, good evening, everybody, as we're welcoming you all into our event tonight, our faculty masterclass, and it's a privilege for us to have you join us tonight. My name is Will Makris. I'm one of the admissions advisors, been with the program since we launched, but that's enough about me. On our back end, also with us, Juliet is a member of our team, and we're going to be working just on the background to see if we're going to be doing, if you have some specific programmatic questions. But the most important thing for us is to spend some time with Professor Roberto Rigobon. It's a real pleasure for me to briefly introduce you to him, because I think what you'll tell very quickly is he has significant accomplishments. For his career, he has been focused on financial contagion and financial crisis. His PhD is from MIT in the late 90s. I'll save you a couple of years there, Roberto. And also as a native of Venezuela, and spent his university education there as well. Award-winning faculty member with us, a favorite of our executive MBA students. And without further ado, please, Roberto, take us away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So thank you so much for everybody for being here. Let me just share my iPad and we will start right away. So let me tell you more or less what I would like to do. I would like this to be a conversation. So as we go along, I will be paying attention to the chat and also to the Q&A. So anywhere you write your questions, it will be appreciated. And what I want to do is to talk about two things. One is, in general, why countries go banks go bankrupt. Like what is so particular about banks that makes them so vulnerable? And then the second thing that I want to do is to look at Silicon Valley and what were the three mistakes that were made. The third aspect is that we can talk a little bit about how the contagion is going to happen and how all other things might be affected. But I think we're at the onset, so it's very difficult to answer the third one. But we can certainly chat about it. So I'll tell you a little bit, at least in general terms, what we know about financial contagion and in general, what we know and what we learn about it. Okay, so my purpose is to speak for, let's say, 30 minutes, no more than that, and then take your questions. So in fact, I will send the notes by the way, this is being recorded. I forgot to say that. This is being recorded, and after that, you will have access to both the recording and the notes. So what makes banks so special? And by the way, this is something that in the 1980s, people thought that banks were going to disappear because at the time, we started creating many instruments and many other financial institutions that were doing what banks used to do. So I noticed that someone is from Ghana, for example, I'm from Venezuela. So in a country like Venezuela, in a country like Ghana, it's very understandable that banks are needed because banks do everything. I mean, banks lend, banks analyze risk, banks diversify risk, banks transfer, capital from one type of individuals to other type of individuals. So banks actually do every single financial transaction. But I saw some else that was from London and New York. See, that's an interesting question. Why on earth do we have banks in New York? I mean, by the way, when you walk in the street, the banks look pretty big. So, they don't seem to have disappeared since the 1980s. And but when you think about it, the banks in New York are not good at diversifying risk. A mutual fund is much better. Banks are not very good at evaluating risk. For example, credit rating agencies do that, and they're much better. Banks are not good at intermediating funds. We have capital markets for that are orders of magnitude more efficient. So, stock market, bond market, etc. That's the place where we intermediate the funds. So in the end, when you actually think about it, why banks exist is not for the typical reasons that we used to assign to banks. And what happened is the 1980s, there was the disintermediation of the banking system started to happen. And then we realized what was the essence of the banking system. And the essence is what is called maturity transformation. So a bank takes funds and resources. By the way, this is more or less my typical class. I'm just doing like a shorter version. Is that okay? So I'm going to actually skip some of the things that I do in class, but this will be exactly the class that I give at MIT. So we take funds from depositors that their maturity truly is instantaneous. Maturity is 0. So depositors think that deposits should be instantaneously available and liquid for them. And the bank transforms that into loans that are actually long-term, okay? And in fact, in the old times used to be 20 years. That's not true today. I would say that the typical maturity now would be 5 to 7 years, maybe. That's about the typical maturity that you will have today. This is the only institution that does this transformation. So, and we have created many institutions to be able to do this transformation properly. And what happened in the 1980s is that when we were disintermediating the banking system away from all the other activities like investment banking, creation of instruments, stuff like that, actually banks became more important in our societies, because by specializing on the activity that was absolutely crucial for them, we were able to actually have massive gains of efficiency and much better regulation. It was not hidden by all these other set of activities that were surrounding the banking system. So instead of disappearing, actually they became incredibly big worldwide and so on. So now let me explain more or less how this works. And again, I apologize, I'm going to be actually doing this relatively fast. I hope that some of you know a little bit of accounting. So I'm going to put a T account, okay? In a T account, the assets are on the left side, and the liabilities and the equity are on the right side of that balance sheet that I'm trying to reflect here. When a depositor puts money into the banking system, we create a checking account, for example. Let's assume that this is a checking account, and these are the deposits. And those deposits, let's say it's 100, just for the sake of the discussion. I am going to put things in this balance sheet depending on their maturity. Is that okay? I'm going to separate them. The deposits tend to be very short-lived, and what banks do is they hold a little bit of cash, much smaller, and I'm going to put a number that is much bigger than reality. I'm just going to put 10, but it's so much bigger than reality. So cash is very liquid, and then they provide loans, and the loans are have higher maturity. So that's 5 to 7 years. And then they also have, for example, other assets here. That's usually the building, no? So that's a 30-year. And then the equity, you will put the equity. Actually, the equity is infinitely lived. The maturity of equity is infinite. I mean, people don't realize that, but when you buy a stock, from IBM, the promise of IBM is that they will never give you your money back. Okay, so they don't say that when they sell you the stock, because might scare some investors. But truly, you give the money, and they said, I'm sorry, I will never give it back. If you want your money, find another person to buy it, the stock from somebody else. I'm not selling it. And in fact, there are some equity and some stocks that are convertible, so it can be changed to a bond, and then you will get the money back. But they need to have that additional option, otherwise they don't exist. So the idea of all these activities in the banking system is because these deposits have a maturity of 0 and people can leave the bank at any moment in time, we want to provide some cash. And that cash here is meant to deal with some of these liquidity needs. The other thing that we want is to have some equity. And the reason why we want so the cash is providing this liquidity. Second, the government, which is an institution that is outside the banking system, provides a guarantee. They tell the depositors, you don't need to run, you don't need to get out, don't worry, you can stay in the banking system. Why they do that? Because when the depositors are leaving, imagine that $11 leave, so you only have 10, so you gave 10, so the 11th person leaves. Now the bank is going to be forced to sell, they're going to be forced to sell these loans in the secondary market. And that might imply a loss. And when you sell at a loss, what's going to happen is that even though you give some of the cash to the depositor so they can leave, part of that losses go against the equity. And therefore the equity will be affected. Let me just change these colors. So I think it's just, anyway, let me just change the colors a second. Good color there looks good in the class, but not here. Okay, so this goes here and this goes against the equity. So there are losses. So what the government wants to tell people is don't worry, stay home, don't run. And we're going to provide a guarantee, and that guarantee is to try to avoid any run against the banking system. So there are these two parts of institutions. This guarantee here is trying to avoid or protect the depositor from leaving. The equity also plays another role, is that these loans, you see, the cash has no price fluctuation. The cash is just $10 and it will stay $10. But these loans go up and down in their price. And that implies that when the price of the loan goes up and down, there has to be a buffer. Something has to adjust on the other side of the balance sheet. And what adjusts is the equity. So every time something happens to the price fluctuation, that impacts directly the equity of the bank. So therefore, the size of the equity is related to the risk of these loans. If you have loans that are very risky, whose prices are going to be fluctuating a lot, then you need to put more equity. And again, the reason why we do that is we are only protecting depositors. Here, actually, they don't care about the loans, they don't care about the equity holders, they don't care about the buildings. That doesn't matter at all. The whole point here and the whole system of regulation is to guarantee that the depositors can collect their money back. And these three things that I just showed you exist in every single country, okay? Every single country has a regulation where the equity, the size of the equity, by the way, in banking, we don't call it equity, we call it capital. And that's the name. It's a capital requirement. And this, we don't call it cash, we call it reserves, okay? This is just, in case you ever encounter that. We economists make names that make no sense whatsoever. So people don't understand what we say. And that makes us, feel more, I don't know, more needed, okay? Like, you will not understand a single thing. You see, capital usually is an asset, no? Not a liability. Yes, you're correct, Molly. Same thing in science. Yeah. We want to pretend to be a science, so we make up names. But actually, we economists are way better than all scientists. We make things like quantitative easing. And I have to tell you, I was in front of the central banker when he was announcing that we were going to do quantitative easing. That's not the US, just a different country. But, he says, we are going to implement quantitative easing. And then, a reporter, raises their hand and says, can you tell us what quantitative easing means? And he says, we we're easing a quantity. That was the answer. So people in the audience said, oh, now we get it, you idiot. Anyway, so we in banking, the names of the accounts are different. And by the way, in central banking accounting, the name of the accounts are even more complicated. So, but the point I want to say is that the purple, the green, and the orange things here are regulations that we have in the banking system. And the purpose of all that is to protect the depositors. And therefore, it needs to be some form of surveillance of the banking system. Because when you have to decide the capital by looking at the loans, you see, and you need to decide the cash depending on what happens to the depositors. And so here everybody has to be paying attention. The reserves, so the cash has two parts. One, what is called required reserves. This is what the regulator or the FDIC would say, you need to have these. And the other one is called excess reserves, which are kind of the reserves that kind of the bank wants to hold because they feel that they're at risk. So everybody should be paying attention to this. Now, one thing that you notice that I have not put here are assets, other financial assets. So, and the reason is that the loans, you are supposed to hold them until the end of life. And the regulation assumes that if a bank gives a loan, somebody will hold the loan until maturity. So therefore, I gave you $100,000 of a loan. You will be paying, let's say, 5% interest rate for 3-4 years, and then at the end of the 3-4 years, you will give me back my 100,000 plus interest. But forget about the interest. You will give me back my capital and the principal. So in general, it is always assumed that somebody will pay their loan at the end, and somebody will hold that loan at the end. By the way, the 2008 crisis happened because we didn't have that residual claimant. Okay, it was a mistake in the Congress regulation where we did not clarify who was responsible of collecting the loans at the end. So we gave millions of loans and nobody was actually collecting anything. And not only that, the banks knew, well, I give a loan and I don't have to collect. And the person says, well, I get a loan, but I don't have to pay. So, we created a financial crisis by first, a complicated financial instrument that was very complicated for people to understand. But second, truly, that asset implied that no one was responsible of collecting the loan. The Dodd-Frank regulation that happened right after that crisis meant to solve that, and actually banks are supposed to hold until maturity. So if you give a loan, especially a mortgage, you are supposed to be the last one, okay? So if the person defaults, the bank is the one that is supposed to have a loss, or a bank, because I can sell it to a bank, okay? So, but someone in the banking system, at the end of the day, needs to be responsible of collecting the loan. But something interesting here is that there's no financial assets. In fact, we don't want banks to be holding financial assets, because imagine that this bank suddenly decides to buy something like Tesla, okay? So first, Tesla stocks last forever. So first, is infinitely long. And second, this thing fluctuates like crazy. So in fact, let me put Bitcoins, okay? And so well, I don't want the bank to have Bitcoins, because then Bitcoins when they buy it at 65,000 and now that is at 25,000, well, that's a massive loss. And the loss goes against the equity, because the loss would not go against the depositors. Look at the difference when a mutual fund buys Bitcoins. When Fidelity says, we're going to buy Bitcoins and we're going to sell participations, but by the way, I don't know if Fidelity has a mutual fund on crypto assets, but let's assume they have. Is that okay? So they will put like Bitcoins here, and then they said Ethereum here, and they pick really bad ones, okay? Like, whatever you want. Doge now is having a price going up because Elon Musk put it on the Twitter in the Twitter symbol. Well, what Fidelity does is that they take all that and then they produce the equivalent of a securitization. They give you an asset here, partitions, and then they sell these to different investors, different depositors. And they specifically tell you that if the left-hand side of this balance sheet moves up or down, your participation will go up and down. So in other words, all the fluctuation here goes against you, the depositor in this case, or in this case, you are called an investor because you are risky. There's no guarantee that you will collect the money. And therefore the capital, the small capital that is here to sustain that hedge fund, which is actually tiny, is totally protected. There's zero losses here. Very zero loss, because everything that happens on the left will go to the right, okay? In the banking system, everything on the left has to have an impact on the right. It's just that is happening on the capital, okay? So there were several mistakes on the Silicon Valley. But by the way, they can hold some of this. It's not like they cannot, okay? They're allowed. But when they do, there's an immediate equity requirement here that is very big. So it's very costly for a bank to hold financial assets. You can hold them for a short period of time, but not. The capital requirement will respond. And the problem is that when you have something risky on the left, they will pay attention to the right. So what were the mistakes? There were three mistakes. Well, no, two mistakes and one trigger, okay? So two mistakes and one trigger. So one is the mistake of mismanagement. So let me just talk about mismanagement. First, this bank was managed horribly, okay? Let me just make sure that I start with the diagnostic. I'm gonna use this financial crisis for a couple of years in classes because this was just absolutely horrible management. So let me tell you all the things that were incorrect here. First, the deposits. The deposits were concentrated. The deposits had a little bit of the deposit, and when I said a little bit, it's like less than 20%, okay? We're actually people like you and me. All the other deposits were for companies or, companies that were in two sectors, technology and biotech. Okay, that's it. So in other words, if something bad happens to technology, firms in technology are going to start withdrawing their cash because they need it for operations. And now you have only two depositors, truly, because the shock to technology will be a common shock. The shock to biotech is a common shock. Not a single bank ever does this. Is that clear? Actually, the banks will have the part, they love people. And the reason why you love people is that it's very difficult for every citizen in the United States to get a liquidity need on the same day. Really difficult. So, you want people. So you never do this. And this was actually at the onset in December, almost 90% of the deposits were in two sectors, companies from two sectors. So what this implies, you see, is that if you know that this part here is common, that means that shock is very big. That means that you should have a lot of cash, don't you think? So in other words, if all the sector withdraws, then you need a lot of cash, so you are not selling assets at a discount. And these guys manage this very beautifully, because if this, by the way, this number was about $250 billion. That's not a small number. This cash, this beautiful cash here, was less than $10 billion. So they had no cash. Truly, they had almost no cash. Then they had almost no loans. Very little loans. And what they had on the balance sheet, on the asset side, okay, about 70% of the asset side were financial instruments. Now, why? So in other words, and by the way, the capital, and I'm going to tell you now the second mistake, the capital here was not regulated. So the authority, the the financial regulator that should have looked into the size of this guy and force a capital requirement here, that we changed the law, I think in between 2016 and 2018, we changed the banking law. And by 2020, this had completely changed, was implemented, and it had a 2 years of grace period before the banks were going to be regulated. And it happens to be that between 2020 and 2022, the deposits from Silicon Valley grew from about 50 billions to 250 billions. So there was $200 billion of additional deposits that were coming here in the form of companies. The bank didn't have ability to transform that into loans. So they said, okay, let me buy financial assets, financial instruments. I mean, by the way, they were making a lot of money. They were making a huge amount of money, because that means that $200 billion, they're paying 0% interest rate on that. And when you buy financial assets, you are getting some interest rates. And again, when interest rates are zero, the price of bonds are very high, and therefore they were actually making a huge amount of money. And unfortunately, the regulator did not regulate. By the way, there are documents on the Federal Reserve and the FDIC that they knew that these losses had occurred by July of last year. So July of last year, they already knew that the value of the financial assets has come down, and that has wiped out almost entirely all the capital. I think the capital of Silicon Valley was about 18 or 9 or 20 billion dollars, and the losses were of the order of 12 to 15 billion dollars on the asset side. So it was completely wiped out. And again, you don't need that much, truly. I mean, if you have about $200 billion here, you don't need that much of a fluctuation to wipe out the right-hand side. And therefore, instead of the capital had been responded and been forced to put capital to compensate, the regulator didn't do their job because of this grace period. By the way, I don't think that the regulation was that bad. I just think that there's no reason why to give 2 years for the banks to adjust to a new regulatory system. Just implement it. And there are these thresholds about the size of banks, and when you cross this threshold, you enter a different regulatory framework. I think that makes sense, by the way. I think a bank of $50 billion in the United States should not be regulated the same way. The banking system of the United States is about a little bit less than $30 trillion. So you see, a bank of $50 billion is too small. Don't waste regulatory capital on that one. You see my point? So I think it made sense. And in fact, actually at $250 billion is small. It's a small bank, very small bank. So, you know, we want to treat them differently. So I want to treat the, JP Morgan differently than Silicon Valley. But there's no reason that a bank that crosses this threshold has a delay in the regulatory, watchdogs. I mean, if you cross 50 billion, you enter the new regulatory environment, period, done. I pay attention, you move to the next one. There's a question, does the capital represent the bank's profit or losses? Two things, Sebastian. It will have the equity, so the equity that has been issued, and also all the cumulative profits and losses in the banking system. That's why the losses in the financial assets go against the capital implicitly. But actually, they didn't have to do that, because this regulation here that was being delayed implied that you didn't have to mark the financial assets to market. In other words, when the price of the financial instrument goes down from 100 to 90, you have a loss, okay, of 10, but you don't need to actually document it. You don't. You just hold it. And actually, it goes in the balance sheet as if the loss has never happened. And this is actually the account that the FDIC and the Fed were actually paying attention to. They said there are losses there, there are contingent losses, So the day they need to sell these financial assets, the losses will be realized, and that day goes against the capital. Now, when you have small banks, that's the way to regulate a small bank. But a $250 billion is not a small bank. Is that clear? And furthermore, this bank is doing something incorrect, which is investing in financial instruments. You see? So the two mistakes are the regulation was too slow to act. And even though we knew about it, they couldn't act because the law said that you have 2 years of grace period. So you can behave as an idiot for 2 years and there's no problem. And by the way, not surprisingly, this started to boom at the end of COVID and boomed all the way to 2022. So that's why we have the crisis in 2023. By the way, Silicon Valley tried to find capital and issue equity to compensate for the losses. They just couldn't find it. So that was one mistake. The regulation was a mistake. But then the second one, there are all these mismanagements. Okay, I mean, there are many places here that they did incorrect. So one, the concentration of deposits, too little cash. And then actually, if you get the deposits and you cannot give loans, just don't collect the deposits. Banks say no. In fact, actually, most of you that are foreigners, when you come to the United States, you want to open a bank account and try to open a bank account in Chase. And they would, Chase is going to say, sorry, baby, no chance. Like, Chase rhymes with chance. So no chance. Get out of here. And said, you can open an account, go to Silicon Valley if you want. I mean, they don't get it. So if you cannot actually do your job, which is maturity transformation, you should not actually collect the cash. So they were too easy and they were too eager to collect all the cash from the technology firms. They were at the time, it was easy deposit and easy money. But then at the end, they put at risk all of that. The trigger was the increase in the interest rates. You see, the Fed actually, by increasing the interest rates, the trigger, let me just put that in green if you want. What happened is that the Fed, by increasing the interest rate, they created the loss here. Is that okay? It was the fact that the interest rates on the Fed goes up. That implies that the price of the bonds go down. And these are the losses. So that's the trigger. So let me take all the questions. This reminds me of the mentality, the people running at the bank, at the run banks on the Soviet period. Yes, by the way, Jane, I have spent my life studying financial crisis, and I would say that I have studied more than 150 financial crises. There's more than one crisis per year, okay, in the last 100 years. The old crises are kind of the same. All banking crises, there are two types of crises. One is exchange rate crisis, and the other one are banking crisis or financial crisis. The financial crisis, they all look identical. It's always a problem of mismatch on the accounts that I'm just showing you. Let me tell you, why were they allowed to have so little liquidity? Jane, it was just these different regulatory frameworks. So if you are above $250 billion, you have one regulatory framework. Below that, you have a different regulatory framework. And because in 2018, it was changed, it was moved from 50 to 250, the banks that were in that range were in a limbo. It was a mistake. Now, Congress, I mean, when Congress changes the threshold, I truly have no problem with them changing the threshold. But there's no reason why you have to give a grace period where you don't have to mark to market. That's just stupid. You see, Jane, that makes absolute no sense. I said, you have to mark. So if there are losses and there are contingent losses, you have to create the provisions. I think I answered Sebastian's question about the profits and losses. Yes, this allows for some super wonky balance sheet action. Absolutely. Wow, Jane. I mean, I am answering all the Jane questions. If there's any Jane here as well, I'm going to answer only Jane questions for a while. What do you consider will be some of the changes in the banking system on the next years? Well, first, and now every bank will be actually regulated. So I actually think that the regulators are going to pay attention to that. And in fact, right now, I think they're trying to clean up the balance sheets. The report from the FDIC so says that the losses, these contingent losses, are close to $1 trillion. Okay? It's not small. It's a huge, huge, huge amount. So they are concerned because this implies that there are losses that are taking place, and you know, we have to correct that. So the first thing is going to be, the short run is cleaning up, but then the second is they're going to mark to market. I mean, they're not going to allow this to happen again. By the way, I think the regulation has already changed. It's a very good question, Antonio. Just to clarify, why SVB not loan out of their deposit money? Well, it's because giving a loan is much harder than buying treasury bonds. When you buy treasury bonds, so when I give a loan, I have to do all the due diligence. I have to go to the firm, check what the assets of the firm are, what is the purpose of the loan, put the terms, get a lawyer, and then sign the stuff. Very complicated. Buying a treasury bond for the United States, I just go to the market and purchase it. You understand? So if I'm being flooded with cash, it's much easier just to purchase a financial asset. But again, when you buy a financial asset, you are putting the depositors at risk. By the way, they were not the only ones doing this. I mean, I think that there are like 10 or 20 banks. Try to find, let me see if I can find the slide that I used for the class, because I found these losses in them. I didn't know this before, okay? By the way, just for the record. I didn't know this. I found it in I think it was Goldman Sachs. I think Goldman Sachs had the report. So again, I didn't know exactly that this was happening. So when it happened, I was as surprised as everybody else. But I am going to get the slide so I can show you. In a second, I will do that. Okay. So let me answer more questions. Ricardo, in Mexico, they have a really tight regulation, and we never had a financial crisis because of the banks. We have had for other plenty reasons. Well, actually, Ricardo, in Mexico, you used to have one every 6 years in the government. So that's pretty much a lot, okay? So you had one crisis in 1976, then another crisis in 1982, then you missed the 6 years window because the third one was on 1989, and then you went back to the 6 years because you have another one in 1994. So Mexico had a regularity, and by the way, every one of these crises was after the elections. They have presidential elections in August. The president takes over in December, and then 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, they were actually having a massive devaluation. They were all mostly about mismanagement on the fiscal account, but truly they were the same misbehavior. Truly was the same. So, for example, in 1970, let me start with 82, is that they overborrow private, so state-owned enterprises overborrow from private banks in the US, and they borrow in excess, they go bankrupt. So immediately after that, we said, we're not going to have individual loans anymore. We're going to have one single bond market. So the central government is the one that borrow. We created the Brady plan. We actually issue a lot of new loans. And now they started, borrowing like crazy in Brady's, and they went bankrupt again. So that's the second crisis. And then the third crisis was 1994, is they said, oh, you cannot borrow. We're going to count the total amount of debt. And they were actually borrowing in dollars versus in pesos. And there was a mismatch in currency. So it's always a mismatch between the assets and the liabilities. You just have to find what the mismatch is. By the way, Mexico did not have the other form of mismatch, which is credit risk, that is in Argentina in 2001. By the way, between Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, you have every single flavor of crisis ever in the history of humankind. And if you want to know the country that had more crises, the fastest was Jamaica. It had 7 crises in 5 years. That requires a magnificent amount of talent. I mean, you have to be super talented to cause crises that are that fast. This is like a superpower to do it. They have 7 programs of the IMF to be able to do that. So I am answering, there's a lot of questions I'm answering a little bit. I might be actually jumping from one to the other. Luan, bank equity capital value, how does that reflect in the balance sheet or market? Is that the price of their shares? No, Luan, no. That's very good question. This was not reflected in the price of the loans because these loss of the stock, because these losses were contingent losses and the market was not paying attention. So imagine, so what this happens, imagine you have 10 on cash, okay? You have 100 on deposits. Let's assume that you have 20 on capital, okay? I'm just making up numbers, is that clear? And therefore, let's assume that there was 110 on financial assets, okay? And this is crazy. This is not what happened, but this is just to give you an idea about this. So what occurs is that the market value of the financial assets, okay, goes from 110, goes down to, let's say, 90. Is that clear? So there's a loss in the financial market, but in the balance sheet, they are not forcing me to mark to market because these financial assets have a different denomination. They are called hold until maturity. But you will never hold to maturity these assets if some depositors leave the bank. You see my point? If any depositors leave the bank, you will not be able to hold these bonds to maturity. You can't. And therefore, you have to sell them. But this special denomination implied that you did not need to reprice the financial assets. So in the balance sheet, it looks like it's 110, when truly, the balance sheet, let me just put this in blue, okay? But the true value of the balance sheet will be cash is 10, deposits are 100, this guy is 90, and capital is 0. Is that okay? So in blue are the true market values. And by the way, I cooked it to get 0 capital, okay? So you have a loss, you have a contingent loss, and the contingent loss takes place when the people leave. That's why there's so many people that are saying that this was caused by Twitter or panic in social media. No, that's not true. I'm telling you, you put in Twitter that people has to leave JP Morgan. JP Morgan, there's no problem with JP Morgan. You can tweet whatever you want about JP Morgan. You know, this is a bank. This is almost like, I mean, this will be my metaphor. This is a bank that decides, instead of going on the long road to go around the lake, this is a frozen lake, so decide to go in the middle of the lake. And they're just walking in the lake, and then they realize, wow, you know, the ice is really thin, so let me just walk very slowly. And then they're walking very slowly. Suddenly a truck passes by, honks, they get distracted, and then they drown. And clearly it's the truck's fault. No, I'm sorry. the truck, you know, you should be robust to trucks, okay? That's the whole point. So next time, don't go through the middle of the lake. And this bank decided to go through the middle of the lake. When you have all these financial assets here, you are on thin ice. That's simple. That's a mismanagement. So you couldn't see it in the stock because they were not repriced, but there were, I do think that there were hedge funds and people that were paying attention to these losses. And they said, oh, they must have losses. They're not reported, but there has to be losses there. And therefore they were shorting the stock because they knew it was going to go down. So it was not seen in the stock price. But that's a beautiful question. Beautiful question. TJ, how will you build a bank that focuses on a specific market? Wow, what a great question. Wow, I will not. I think that a venture capitalist can do that. I think a mutual fund can do that. But I don't want depositors to be at risk. You see, TJ, I mean, think here again, you see, a mutual fund. You tell a mutual fund, I'm going to lend, or I'm going to, in fact, you can create a mutual fund that says, I'm going to have 5-year loans to biotech. And then you finance this with individuals that are investors. And you said, well, when the price of these loans fluctuate, then your your participation will fluctuate, and then you will have capital gains and capital losses. So see, that's the way I will do it, because I don't want to guarantee something to the depositors when I am super concentrated in a sector. So I will not do it through the banking system. The banking system is being financed by depositors, and I want to guarantee those depositors. The same with Social Security, for example, TJ. When people put their money on retirements, I don't want to tell them that I have invested everything in Coca-Cola. I mean, that would be crazy. By the way, in the United States, the Californian pension fund actually invested for many, many years on tobacco. They had massive losses because they thought that tobacco, was going to have a comeback because they were being punished, but punished excessively, and they overinvested the pension funds of Californian teachers in tobacco. They had massive losses. Massive losses. Pension funds should not do that. Pension funds should be investing in everything. A sovereign wealth fund should be investing in the whole world. You want them to be diversified. Again, because your depositors, so this is not only for deposits, for that implicit guarantee. See, a sovereign wealth fund should be safe. Pension fund should be safe. A deposit in a banking system should be safe. So I will not do that. It's a very good question. I think I will organize it by a mutual fund. By the way, I don't think that exists. 3 to 5 year loans to a sector. I don't think that a mutual fund like that exists. So that might be a good idea. There you go. So even if you don't apply to MIT or you hear it here first, you can go and make some money. Just give me 10% afterwards. Is that okay? Yeah, I'm very nice about that. Salim, recently I started noticing banks tightening their grip on lending. Yes, absolutely. They have to. The interest rates are going up, which means that less and less of us are good credit. So they should be tightening this a lot. No, I don't think this is because it's improving their balance sheet. Is this because lending is costlier and we are becoming more risky? So therefore, banks should be holding more cash and providing less loans. And the price of loans, the interest rate on the loans should be shooting up much faster than the interest rates on the deposits. So these are two things that have to happen, and always happens in inflationary environments. Is Coco bond similar to hedge fund concept? I don't know, Jason. I don't know what a Coco bond is. Sorry about that. Who is accountable or responsible in the bank to control these metrics? Oh, Claudine. I mean, the bank itself should do their work. I mean, you have a risk management team inside the bank, and you have board members, and there has to be a board member that is in charge of the risk. So part of this is the governance of the bank, but also the regulator. I mean, both the regulator here will be called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. They should actually have paid the attention. In other countries, it's called the superintendent. What's your view on the big banks shoring up First Republic Bank? Kin, very good question. I think that what they're doing is trying to clean up the balance sheet. So let me explain. Let me show you how you can clean up a bank by another massive bank buying. Is that okay? So I have First Republic here, imagine, and let's assume that First Republic has 200 deposits. I am making up numbers. I don't know. It was smaller than this. Has 200 deposits, 200 billions, have, let's say, 0 on capital because it's bankrupt. Is that okay? Just at the moment where we do the pricing, they have only 20 on cash, and they have 180 on financial assets. Is that okay? So let's assume this is Silicon Valley, a bad bank, and actually has 0 on capital. So we are kind of bankrupt. Now I'm gonna buy this by JP Morgan, and let's look at the JP Morgan assets. Is that okay? JP Morgan. So first, JP Morgan has something like 3 trillion on deposits. Okay, and they're overcapitalized. So capital is much more higher than what they need. So they will have like 300 on capital. Is that okay? And then cash, they have way more cash. I mean, the JP Morgan bank side, I don't know, probably has like, 500 billion on cash, maybe even more than that. And then they have loans. They have no financial assets. They have a tiny financial asset here. Okay, financial assets. They say that they have on financial assets, like 300, and then the rest will be 2.2 trillion on loans. So guess what? When I put the two balance sheets, the balance sheet from First Republic, they are all tiny numbers. You see my point? When I put them together, I'm going to create a new bank. Well, then, deposits are 320. Okay, so it's okay. Capital is 300. So it still is a good capital. Cash is 520. It's okay. I don't notice. Loans are 2.2 thousand. Okay. And financial assets, well, they're bigger, but it's 480. Not that bad. Still, this is very small. The fluctuation on this guy will have no impact on this guy. Actually, these numbers are not correct. I mean, I can assure you that financial assets are smaller and capital is bigger. So not even close. They are not even on the same order of magnitude. Capital from JP Morgan has to be much higher than the financial assets. Much, much higher. So truly, they don't, this is completely relevant. Completely relevant for JP Morgan. Just like, who cares? JP Morgan Bank, okay? So that's the beauty. So you sell it to a big bank because the big bank can absorb that, and then immediately the weakness in the balance sheet disappears. Furthermore, all these 200, I would have actually made the venture capitalists, sorry. Oh, crap. On the venture capitalists, I would have actually forced a loss here. I would have told the VCs that you lose 20%, something like that. Said, if you're stupid, you should pay. That's a very good rule in regulation. So I would have actually told them, or I will tell them, you cannot get your cash now. You will get your cash in 5 years. You will get 1/5 per year for 5 years. And if you don't like it, you can stay in Silicon Valley. This is very simple. You can stay there or you abide to the laws. But actually, I would have made these guys pay for their incompetence. The depositors have to be incompetent to do that. So yeah, I am, by the way, I have seen far too many financial crises. I am completely and absolutely merciless. I have 5 minutes. Wow, what would a government bailout or SVB look like? Exactly what I said. We just, this is not a bailout. They are bailing out the depositors, not the capital. It's very important to separate the two. In 2008, we bailed out everything. We actually gave money in such a way that the equity holders had very little losses. We're not doing that. The equity holders are losing 100%. We are just bailing out these depositors that are too big that should not be bailed out. So it's like a partial bailout. And it's exactly what we're doing. We're guaranteeing that they will not lose their deposit. That's the bailout. We're guaranteeing that we will do something in such a way that the deposit will be recovered. Any similarities from the current solvency issues with the banking crisis of Venezuela in 1994? Oh, Roberto. No, it's a little bit different. But we gave very bad loans in Venezuela. And they were actually betting a little bit. Some of the banks were betting on financial assets and stocks. But it was actually bad loans that we gave, very bad loans, very bad quality of the loans. So the bankruptcy came not on the change evaluation of the instrument, it was changing the valuation of the loans. This price here that I'm drawing here, that price is the one that changed a lot and produced a loss. What will happen if China dumped their stake in American assets? I mean, the treasuries, not that much. The US has about $30 trillion on debt and only 3 trillion are in China. By the way, 3 trillion are in Japan and about a little bit less than 3 trillion are in OPEC. So you see, the OPEC and Japan are all on the same size of China. So China has a lot of debt, it's 10%, but if China dumps this, is one big investor selling $3 trillion, by the way, China will get a big loss by selling that, but the United States, it will be, I mean, the interest rates will go up. That's it. but it's only 10%. It's just that it's an easy target. For some reason, China is an easy target. So people do that. Why did UK SVB was rescued by another bank? Well, it was purchased by $1, and Vikram is the same reason. It's just to put all the weak balance sheet inside of a massive bank in such a way that that you cannot see it. The ultimate purpose of accounting is reflecting a fair image of a bank company. You know, Chiara, yes, but if you come to MIT, one of the first classes is going to be financial accounting, and you will see that actually accounting is not that exact science. It's not an exact science. I mean, truly, we have spent 150 years changing our accounting worldwide, okay, on everything, and we still don't know what the revenue is, and we still don't know what earnings are. You have an estimate. Accounting is an estimate of what happens in reality. And I'm not talking about like criminal behavior where I'm trying to hide things. Is that there are norms about how do we account for things, and there are many uncertainties about how to do the accounting. So even though accounting should reflect the fundamentals of the firm, we know they do not. So by the way, Rodrigo is a super teacher, and he's the one that always teaches the EMBAs. Is that correct, Will? It's always Rodrigo, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah,
bring
Rodrigo
that ambiguity right to the face of the
yes. So you see, a Brazilian teaches you accounting, and a Venezuelan teaches you macroeconomics. You are doomed. You will have every single crisis and mismanagement on earth. We can explain you everything. So
I think I'd call it job security. You've got the job security on this.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you so much.
I mean, there are too many questions
for folks.
Yeah, I apologize. I cannot go through all your questions. I mean, thank you for all your questions in the chat and everywhere. I just we can spend hours on this, and we did actually. We spent last 2 weeks ago 3 weeks ago when the SVB was going bankrupt. We had a special class with the EMBAs, and we actually spent 2 hours and a half on this because there are millions of questions. So I apologize for not being able to address all your questions. Sorry about that, but it's a great pleasure. I hope that our path cross together and cross again. And if you are here at MIT, I'll see you. I see you on your second year. So the first year they torture you with other bad professors that have no sense of humor. I'm joking. And then I take over. So I see you at the end.
Well, I think you've given our audience tonight just a snapshot of what the experience can be, because our faculty is so serious, and research. No, I mean, they're about engaging with you, and that's just part of this journey. There are over 40 faculty members who teach in the program, and just thank you for tonight. It's I think many of us have had big days, long days, and I'm kind of supercharged. So thank you for tonight. So
yeah, and this is me without coffee.
Look out. I'll send you a Red Bull and we'll see what happens.
No, I don't drink that. So anyway, again, no, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure always to be here. And it's a shame that we're talking about a financial crisis, but I hope that this is a teaching moment to learn. We repeat this over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Yes, I stopped doing research on financial crisis because it was so boring. I was writing the same paper and then doing search and replace. For this class, when I was meeting the MBAs, not before I met the EMBAs, I was teaching the MBAs to talk about this. I took the slides from 2001 and I said, these are the slides. Look, it's talking about Argentina, but you will see that everything is a search and replace. You can it's the same examples, the same 100, the same 20, the same 10. I mean, it was the exact same thing. And Argentina was going backwards. I said, you can change here, instead of Argentinian bank, you put Silicon Valley. So it was funny because I was just scratching the slides. I said, it's the same thing, same stuff. I said, you see, that's why I have so many papers. It's the same paper written 20 times.
Well,
So thank you again for this. Thank you, everybody. And I hope that our path cross again. Okay.
thank you so much. You can, as a member of the Sloan faculty, you're probably not surprised. Our last year recipient of Teacher of the Year Award has been with us tonight. So thank you again so much for your engagement. We're just going to have a couple of quick slides on the way out just to frame what else is coming up over the next season. We have 2 application deadlines remaining. April 6th is Thursday, and then our final one will be May 4th. And those decisions will be finalized by the end of June. And then we have some upcoming events over the next week. This Thursday night, if you're in the application process and you have some last minute questions, the admissions advisors will be available for a chat. But then we have a panel on sustainability next week. And then following in-person information sessions in Brooklyn and Philadelphia. And then finally, we have a large event on campus. Welcome you to join us in the evening for the Faculty Insights a Program Insights event, and that'll be on Tuesday, May 2nd. We'll have another faculty presentation and panel of alums. So again, just with this snapshot in brief, if you're interested in challenging yourself and broadening your perspective and having an impact in your chosen industry or careers, please join us for part of that journey. Thank you again, and enjoy your evening.